My name's Rick Melville, and Chip and I were in the same class of '67, and in 1963 we were freshmen, and I was just down the hall when the announcement was made. Go down the hall to the left, and Miss Sanders was an algebra teacher, and we were, I think it was right after lunch. We had just settled in and we were studying algebra, and Mr. Evans made the announcement. My recollection, I don't know, y'all may disagree, I think the first announcement was around 1:30. And I remember a second announcement when they confirmed that the president had died. I remember the first announcement didn't know. They just didn't have information. And it's hard to imagine in those days, there were no cell phones, there were no fax machines, there were no TVs in the school, maybe one TV in the principal's office, but it was never turned on. And there was only news at night at 7 o'clock. There wasn't 24-hour news. So if you wanted news, you had to wait till that night at 7 o'clock unless it was a special event. I really think this was probably the beginning of the idea of 24-hour news, because prior to then, there wasn't 24-hour news. And the last thing I'll say is I did have an opportunity one time when I was in Dallas to go to the school book depository where Oswald shot from, on the 6th floor, and I got a chance to look out that window. And it's still there today, encased in glass, but you can go to that window and look down the street and see the exact view he had of shooting the president. And that was, I have to tell you, that sort of put a chill down my back to know that I was a student here and one day saw what he saw. So anyway, I'll let Linda go next.
I'm Linda Thomas Cook, and I was in the class of 1966. I was sitting in Miss Pilcher's Spanish class when the word came over the loudspeaker, and I remember thinking he was shot, but I thought, well, it must be an accident. That's all it could be. And then the subsequent announcement came on, and finally I realized that our president had been assassinated. And when I think about assassination, I think about President Lincoln. You know, that's something that happened hundreds of years ago. President Kennedy and his family were the closest thing that this country had ever had to royalty. I mean, Jack Kennedy was handsome, he was charismatic, he was a war hero, and he was married to a beautiful woman, and they had 2 lovely kids. And we put them on a pedestal. And for me personally, John Kennedy was the first Catholic president that we had ever had. And a lot of people didn't think that he could be elected. And he was. Back at that time, particularly in the Deep South, there was a lot of prejudice toward blacks, Jews, and Catholics. And it was just amazing that he had been elected president. And there was still a lot of resentment toward him, and that there were a lot of threats to his life because of that. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then. As Rick was saying, we used to get the news after the fact. We would go home and watch the evening news, and we would see what had gone on during the day. I remember watching the news for almost days constantly, which was incredible, that we were seeing it real time. It was probably one of the most moving times in my life. I'll never forget it.
Hey, I'm Janice Hogg, and I want to thank y'all for letting us have the opportunity to come today and share this with y'all. Kennedy was my president. He's the one that got me really interested in politics. And on the day that he was assassinated, I was in Miss Sally Bowen's Latin class. And we were, just absolutely stunned, shocked. And Miss Sally, being the true professional teacher that she was, she just, we had our moment of silence. And we just sat there, and back then, you couldn't get up and hug and love on each other like today. You just sat there, and like Rick was saying, there was an announcement that came back and said he had died. And we were all just absolutely shocked, just devastated. I don't remember going to any other class that day. I just remember going home, being glued to the TV for the rest of the weekend and crying, and not even wanting to come back to school because it was just like he was part of our family. And I still get emotional about it today, just thinking about it. And he was, you know, to me, he was a great family man. And of course, I know there are different theories going around today. And I guess something that really sticks out in my mind now is even back then, my daddy said that Lyndon Johnson had something to do with it. And I just heard a report recently that they think that that was what was going on. So.
I'm Chip Barron, and like Rick, I was class of 1967. I want to start by saying Kennedy had earned a lot of respect at that time. He made a great speech in Germany, and said, "I'm a Berliner," and he also said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." And he started, I think, a thing called the Peace Corps, and it was the beginning, I think, of people really getting interested in doing good things for people all around the world. So I want to start in junior high school, and we had a crisis at that time with Kennedy in charge, and there were missiles being brought into Cuba right off the United States coast, and everybody was afraid that they were going to shoot them at us, and that we might have a nuclear holocaust at that time. And I remember in junior high school, they practiced with us to go down into the basement in case we had a nuclear attack. But Kennedy stood down Khrushchev. Khrushchev hammered around with his shoe and said he was going to destroy us, but Kennedy looked him in the eye and said, "You're not going to bring the missiles in," and he did an embargo of Cuba, stopped the Russian ships from coming, and we didn't know what was going to happen. We thought maybe we were going to be blown up the next day, but sure enough, Khrushchev backed down, and no missiles, as far as we know, I guess, went into Cuba. So everybody had a lot of respect for John Kennedy because of all of that. And I know where I was. I was in Miss Geraldine Welch's class when we got the word. And before they announced on the loudspeaker, Miss Geraldine came running in the class and grabbed her box of Kleenexes, and it was just sobbing. And we didn't know what had happened. And then it came on the loudspeaker that the president had been shot. And of course, there was a lot of shock in that. Some people started crying, and I heard even a few people cheer because some people didn't like Kennedy, but mainly it was people upset that it had happened. And so then it did, I think, as Rick said, came back on eventually, saying that he had indeed died. They took him to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, and he eventually it was announced that he had died. And like Linda said, we didn't know really all the details. It was just kind of vague at that point. But they did let us out of school, and so we went home, and we didn't know what to do, so we just started playing football. I remember behind Joe Parks' house on Parks Avenue, and we pretty much played football all weekend. But I do remember coming in from church on Sunday, as someone, I think Ms. Barbara said, and coming in from church, turning on the TV, and we saw Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. And I'll never forget that. I had never really seen anybody on live TV shot, and I don't know that I really have ever again, but it was a really shocking thing, particularly when you just come in from church, and to have that on your TV. And I want to finish by saying there's a song called Abraham, Martin, and John. I don't know if you ever heard it by Dion. If you haven't listened to it, I'd listen to it because it really tells kind of what we went through with all the assassinations. And it's an interesting song. When I was at Emory in college, Martin Luther King was shot, and I happened to be on the student government at Emory, and they sent all of us to the airport to pick up the dignitaries and take them over to the King house. And so we picked up dignitaries and carted them over to the King's house. And I remember going in the King's house, and seeing Teddy Kennedy sitting at the kitchen table drinking a glass of water in there is one real strong memory I have of that. And we were basically told to go back to Emory and pack up and get out of Dodge pretty much. And so I went back and got my stuff and came home to Newnan for the weekend because there was fear of a lot of riots and everything, but really nothing happened. I think the people that came in were very peace-loving people, and of course Dr. King espoused nonviolence, so there really wasn't anything that I saw anyway in Atlanta that happened then. And eventually Bobby Kennedy was also shot. So we went through a period of terrible things like that, but I think our country has become much stronger and much more aware that these things could happen. I think a lot of us were naive at that time, but I don't think there's a lot of naivety anymore about all of that.
You're a tough act to follow.
Is there anything else to say?
Yeah, the only reason I want to stand up is I used to be at Atkinson, and I don't know if I have any of my little children from Atkinson. They've gotten grown, but I saw some of them. I am married to Joe Child, who teaches here, and he wanted to make sure that y'all knew that I was married to him. So,
he didn't get invited.
he didn't get invited, but he was in college, so he couldn't be invited. He's not eligible. I really do want to thank Steve Quisenberry for asking us. He taught my children in school, and he just made a big impression on them, and he also coached them, and they still ask about Quisenberry, and I'm going to call him and say he's 50 this year, and that's just going to blow them. They're all turning 40. I think that we're all so emotional. I don't know if you can hear it in our voices, but we really are very emotional because you're going to be studying the 60s, and you're going to be learning about the hippies and about everything that happened. And the reason the hippie movement came was because young people started getting involved, and young people's opinions were listened to. And Kennedy became the youthful president. He was our president. And all of us associate with him. I've never had another president that I loved like John F. Kennedy. I have books on him. I'm sure we all do. I'm sure we've seen every movie about what happened in the assassination. I mean, I'm sure this group, we could get together and say, let's share our libraries of the Kennedys and the Kennedy family. Sure, they say things about him now, but for us, he was God. I'm sorry, but he really was. And he looked like a God, too. These people have a better memory than I do. I just know that I was in a biology lab, and I thought you were across the table from me, but you just said you were in another class. So, but I was in Mr. Fletcher's, and that's not Herman Fletcher. This is another Fletcher, biology class, and Jane Barron was my lab partner, and I thought Linda was across from me, but I don't know. And
That was 50 years ago.
Yeah, but I only remember one announcement, and I remember that it was right
That's
at the
because
end
you
of
weren't paying
fifth
attention.
period. And it said, all I knew, the president had been shot. I worked in the library. I was a library helper, and the library was at the end of this hall. And all I had to do was go out of that first class, if you go here to the left, I just had to walk that far, but I remember thinking, I can't even make it into the library to fall into the desk. And we sat there in shock, and then we went home, and we didn't go to school Friday or Saturday or Sunday. We didn't go Monday, and they had the funeral on Tuesday. So we were out of school. You might have played ball, but I sat there in front of the television and cried. I mean, we cried and cried and cried. Then when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot, we were mad because we wanted him to go through something much worse than just getting shot. I mean, I did. I mean, I had a lot of anger. I mean, I hated the guy. And we knew he was guilty, even though he had not been tried and found guilty. We knew that he was guilty. So there were so many things that went on in those 4 days with families just sitting there. We'd have a television this big, so everybody in the family had to sit right there in front of the television. Nobody wanted to go fix food because you might miss something that they might say. I don't know how to explain to you what Kennedy meant, but I can compare it to what the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Everybody that has parents here, their parents will always say, I can tell you where I was when Pearl Harbor happened. And so for our generation, we can tell you where we were when Kennedy was shot, and not much more. Can y'all remember 9/11, or were you too little? Can y'all remember? But barely, you know. So there'll be something in y'all's life that will be, and I'd like to think that it won't happen, but there'll be something that will happen. So, thank you.
Those were the years, we really grew up then. We were very innocent. I'm going to cry. We had a great life here in Newnan. Everybody knew everybody. Everything was happy. And it ended that day. I was in the library. I worked in the library too. It was at the end of the hall. It's still unbelievable that something like that would happen in the United States of America. And then Reverend King, and then Bobby Kennedy. That just didn't happen here. It may have happened in Europe or in the old world, or it just didn't happen here. And we grew up real quick then. And Kennedy was the person who got us. It was the first time I ever cared who was president. You know, it might have been our age, but we not only cared, we wanted to do something, and we wanted to make a mark on the world. That's what he did for our country. He wanted us on the moon, and we got there. He wanted us here, and we did it. He never said you couldn't do it. If you said you couldn't, that just wasn't a word that he understood. He was wealthy. He did live a charmed life. But he wanted everybody to have that life. And in order to do that, you have to get out and make the mark, your mark on the world. Don't let anybody take that away from you. All of you can do whatever you want to if you get this education right here. So, if nothing else, we need to hold all the good things that he gave us. They need to be high on your priority list. You guys right here are going to make the world better, I hope. We've kind of made a mess. But you guys can straighten it out. And that's what he would have told you. Go out and decide what you want to do and go for it. And I think that's what he really impressed on me, that I could do it. And I was a woman who could only teach school and have babies. Well, no, it changed then. We could do anything. Now we could be scientists and it was just it just changed my life completely. And maybe that was the good thing that came out of the bad that happened. But really, I remember that. Of all the presidents, he would have been the one that told you, all of you can be president. All of you can do whatever you want to. Put your mind to it and go for it. But it was a very sad day for our country. And I really kind of hope y'all don't have to go through something like that. And Sean, do you remember, I had a son, Sean Flanagan, that came here and played soccer for you. Said to say hello.
Very good.
Thank y'all for having us.
Can we, ask some questions?
Sure.
I want to start, I'm going to let them, because they are brilliant question askers over here. But a lot of you said you were in, like, science or literature, different classes. I was wondering if you remembered, like, which room. I know the library.
Oh, yeah.
The library was, those double doors where we have classrooms now? That whole thing used to be the library.
We can tell you every teacher on this hall.
When you got to the library, turn left, and I was the first room on the left. We know every room. It was a science lab. And next door to it was a science lab, and there was another science lab across from it.
What about the rest of you? Remember which room it was in?
Yeah.
Miss Sally's was over here.
Miss Ellis was right across the hall. This was Miss Mary Ellen. Is there only one more room right here?
Yeah.
This was Miss Mary Ellen Camp's room.
This is Maggie McGuire's.
She taught us English, senior
Senior
English. The next room was Miss McDonald. She taught senior history. The next room was Miss Rumble. She taught geometry and
Trig and calculus.
Then Miss Sanders was across the hall.
Miss Barber, and then it was Miss Bowen, Miss Sally.
I think you're right. And then Miss Matthews was at the end.
Spanish.
Right here, Pafford. had
Well,
history.
but Miss Maggie McGuire.
Oh, that's right.
was there first.
We could go.
What used to be the principal's office, that's where we were on that hall going down towards the auditorium, that's where I was.
But y'all know that we only had this building. We had the bottom floor and the top floor, and that was the whole school.
Chip, you mentioned in junior high school that y'all had a drill and you went to the basement.
Yep, we did.
Where was the junior high school?
on Jackson Street where the Veterans Memorial Park is now. My dad went to high school there, and I went to junior high school there. It was an old brick and wooden building, and it shook every time a transfer truck went by. And I guess they finally decided it wasn't safe and tore it down. But it was a neat old building.
But when they had the Cuban crisis and we were in high school, we all went to the cafeteria. And we also had to have, don't you remember, we had to have a shelter in your house. Everybody had to determine a place in their house that there would be a shelter in case the Russians dropped a bomb.
And one time Bonnell had do y'all know where Bonnell aluminum plant is here? One night they had an explosion there. And you could feel it in Atlanta. It broke windows in Moreland and everywhere.
We thought a bomb had done.
We thought the Russians
We
had
really
come.
did. I got under my
Everybody
bed.
went to
I really did.
We had been prepared. But they had already started talking about war and everything and where to have shelters and everything. And most people thought that the Russians had bombed the United States until they found out.
My family slept through it.
We didn't live where I lived next door.
We were pretty close.
We were closer.
We're the only people I've ever known that slept through it.
Somewhere at home, I've got in some old papers, I've got a map of the old junior high school. It's called middle school now, but we called it junior high then. And there were big stars on each corner of the school on the streets. And those stars were where you had to stand for your parents to pick you up in case of emergency. And I remember my star was on the corner of Jackson Street and Temple Avenue. And if in the event of emergency they had sent that paper home, that's where my parents could find me, is at that star on that corner. And that's pretty scary when you think about something that dramatic, that your parents have to stop, go get you, and go to a bomb shelter. That's what we lived through.
And also during the Cuban crisis, we had to have dog tags. And, you know, we'd meet in the auditorium in the mornings with Mr. Evans, who would tell us what to do if something happened that day. And I was always so afraid that I would not be able to find my brother on that corner down there.
So the basement was just a basement? It wasn't a
The
real
cafeteria
shelter.
was down there.
And the classroom.
And they had two
Two
classrooms.
classrooms.
Vivian Hambrick and who's that guy? Mr. Pitts.
But the band was downstairs too. In the
I think you're right.
Yeah,
I think you're
John
right.
Rich's band.
All right, well, I've got a lot of other questions, but I'll shut up and give them an opportunity. Rico, yes, sir.
After the assassination, could you tell us probably what are the biggest changes that happened after the assassination and after it was all said and done? Like, if you recall any changes that happened in your life or around in the community or anything?
I think the first biggest thing that happened was the civil rights. And then it's the war. And so it's an either or. But for me, it was the civil rights, because I think that was the next summer. Is that correct?
Yes.
65.
William?
Was the mascot still the same?
We were tigers.
We were the tigers. Yeah, in fact, we're looking for him right now.
Right. We had a big.
Thank you so much.
His name was Willie. We're
We
looking
had
for
a
Willie.
big
if y'all seen
tiger,
him.
and we dressed him up in the
It's a
lobby.
tiger.
Every time you walked in,
They found
we
him.
had dressed.
Amazing.
They found him in
They
the...
pulled him out like
I don't think it's
Where
the
is
same
he?
one.
it was a big tiger.
Yeah.
Was he standing up on legs or sitting down?
He was standing up.
Wrong
He
tiger.
was still here?
No, we'll take that one too. My class would, because that was ours.
What did you see that at?
I was in Mr. Morris's class. He said they pulled it up from the basement.
You should bow down to